July 9, 1944. The northern tip of Saipan, Marpi Point. The air above the limestone cliffs is a thick, suffocating slurry of cordite, decomposing vegetation, and the salt spray of the Philippine Sea. Beneath a sun that feels less like a star and more like a physical weight, the world has been reduced to shades of ash and jagged obsidian. Here, at the edge of the world, the wind does not provide relief. It only carries the screams of those choosing the abyss over the perceived monsters waiting in the tall grass. The dirt is not merely earth, it is a powdered remains of coral and bone, kicked up by the relentless tread of heavy boots and the concussive rhythm of distant artillery. In the shadows of the jagged caves, the silence is more terrifying than the noise, a heavy, damp stillness where the only sound is the ragged breathing of the starving and the rhythmic drip of groundwater that tastes of sulfur. The Japanese civilians huddled in these shadows are ghosts before they have even ceased to breathe. Their skin is pulled taut over cheekbones, gray with the dust of pulverized stone. For weeks, they have lived in a state of sensory deprivation, their world shrinking to the size of a limestone crevice. To these women, the Americans are not men, but the Kichikubaye, the demonic beasts of the West. They have been told since childhood, and with frantic intensity since the invasion began, that to fall into American hands is to invite a fate worse than any hell described in the sutras. They expect to be trampled by tanks, to have their limbs severed as trophies, and to be subjected to indignities that make the leap from a 200-foot cliff seem like an act of mercy. They clutch small, jagged stones or bits of broken glass, prepared to use them on their own throats should the beasts draw too near. On this morning, the humidity clings to the skin like a wet shroud. The American line is a wall of olive drab moving slowly through the scorched brush. For the Marines moving upward, the island is a nightmare of hidden snipers and sudden explosions, but for the women in the caves, the approaching crunch of boots on coral is the sound of the end of the world. They watch through the cracks in the rock as the smoke from the flamethrowers curls into the sky, a black, oily alphabet written against the blue. They are trapped between the mandate of their emperor, who demands they die as shattered jewels for the glory of the throne, and the primal, terrified instinct to simply draw one more breath. The contrast is absolute. The Japanese ideology of aestheticized death clashing against the terrifying, noisy, and overwhelming reality of an enemy that refuses to stop advancing. When the first Marine reaches the mouth of the cave, he does not fire. He stands silhouetted against the blinding tropical light, a massive, rugged figure clad in sweat-stained herringbone twill. To the women cowering in the mud at the back of the cavern, he is a titan of war, armed with a rifle that looks capable of leveling mountains. They press their backs against the cold, damp stone, eyes wide and glassy, waiting for the bayonet or the grenade. They have been primed for the ultimate sacrifice. They have been told that the Americans hate them with a racial purity that precludes any form of pity. The air in the cave is stagnant, smelling of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of fear. The soldier speaks, his voice a low rumble that sounds like the grinding of stones, alien and incomprehensible. He reaches for his hip and the women flinch, certain he is drawing a blade to begin the execution. The tension is a physical cord stretched to the point of snapping, a moment where two civilizations meet in the wreckage of a shattered empire, one expecting annihilation and the other carrying the weight of an unimaginable, casual power. The institutionalized terror that gripped the civilians of Saipan was not an accidental byproduct of war, but a calculated architectural feat of the Japanese imperial government. To understand the trembling women in the caves, one must understand the years of psychological conditioning that transformed the American soldier from a human adversary into a supernatural predator. In the schools of Tokyo and the outposts of the Mandated Islands, the Great East Asia co-prosperity sphere was taught as a divine right, and the encroaching Western powers were depicted as rapacious ghouls. By the time the first American boots hit the beaches of Saipan in June 1944, The civilians had been fed a steady diet of horror stories. They were told that American tanks would be driven over the living, that women would be systematically violated, and that the blue-eyed devils required the blood of the innocent to fuel their war machine. This was the doctrine of Gyokusai, the shattered jewel. The imperial mandate dictated that it was a far greater honor for a civilian to perish as a broken shard of a precious gem than to endure the shame of life under occupation. This was not merely a military order. It was a spiritual ultimatum issued in the name of the emperor, the living god. For the women on Saipan, the geography of their island had become a map of martyrdom. Every cliff, every cave, and every ravine was a potential site for a final, desperate act of loyalty. The historical records of the era reveal a society under such total psychological mobilization that the line between the soldier and the civilian had been erased. The Japanese leadership knew they could not win the battle of steel and fire, so they sought to win a battle of will by demanding the ultimate sacrifice from their own people. As the American forces pushed further inland, the gap between the propaganda and the tactical reality became a chasm of suffering. The Japanese 43rd Division, tasked with the island's defense, found itself increasingly unable to provide even the most basic necessities to the thousands of civilians under its protection. While the Imperial High Command spoke of spiritual superiority and the invincible Japanese spirit, the reality on the ground was one of dehydration, maggots, and the agonizing slow death of the abandoned. The women were trapped in a cruel paradox. Their own protectors had stripped them of water, food, and hope, yet they remained more terrified of the approaching liberators than the starvation that was currently claiming their children. They were prisoners of a false narrative that required their deaths to maintain its internal logic. The Americans, meanwhile, were operating under a completely different set of historical imperatives. To the Marines and soldiers of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions and the 27th Infantry, Saipan was a strategic necessity, a platform for the B-29 superfortresses that would soon bring the war to the Japanese home islands. They moved with a mechanical, industrial efficiency that was incomprehensible to the Japanese mind. They brought with them a logistical tail that stretched back thousands of miles to the factories of Detroit and the farms of Iowa. This was the clash of two irreconcilable worlds, an empire built on the scarcity of resources and the abundance of sacrifice, versus a democracy built on the abundance of resources and the preservation of the individual. As the women watched from the darkness of their hiding places, they saw an enemy that seemed to possess the power of the gods, not because of their cruelty, but because of their terrifying, effortless supply of everything the Japanese lacked. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not be decided by the rifle, but by a simple vessel of water. The emergence from the caves was not a walk, but a primal, stumbling crawl into a world they no longer recognized. As the Marines signaled for the civilians to come forward, the women moved with a jerky, hesitant gait of the condemned. Their eyes, long accustomed to the damp gloom of the limestone interior, were immediately seared by the ferocious glare of the Pacific sun. This was the descent from the ideological heights of the shattered jewel into the visceral, dusty reality of the American front lines. Every step toward the olive-drab figures felt like a step toward a meat grinder. They moved in a tight huddle, clutching children whose ribs were visible through thin cotton tunics, their feet shredded by the sharp volcanic rock that lined the path. The sensory transition was absolute. In the caves, the world had smelled of rot and stagnant minerals. Here, the air was dominated by the heavy, mechanical scent of diesel exhaust and the pungent aroma of American tobacco. The soundscape shifted from the muffled whimpers of the starving to the cacophony of a high-functioning industrial machine. They heard the rhythmic clatter of heavy machine guns in the distance, the roar of Corsair engines overhead, and the boisterous, guttural shouts of men who did not sound like the somber, death-obsessed warriors they had been promised. To the Japanese women, the sheer noise of the American presence was an extension of their perceived savagery, a chaotic, terrifying energy that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. As they reached the perimeter of the American encampment, the emotional contrast reached its zenith. They looked into the faces of the young Marines, men from places like Ohio and California, who stared back with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. The women did not see pity. They saw the predator's appraisal. They waited for the belts to be unbuckled, for the bayonets to be drawn, for the beginning of the end. Their indoctrination had prepared them for a climax of violence, but as they stood in the heat, surrounded by the overwhelming material presence of the U.S. military, they were met instead with a strange, unsettling indifference. The beasts were not pouncing. They were leaning against their equipment, watching the bedraggled group with eyes that held no divine fury, only the weary gaze of men doing a difficult job. This movement from the darkness into the light represented the first crack in the foundation of their world. They had been told that to survive was a disgrace, yet here they were, drawing breath in the presence of the enemy. The physical descent from the cliffs of Marpy Point was a metaphor for the collapse of the imperial myth. They were no longer the spiritual daughters of a warrior state. They were thirsty, terrified human beings standing in the dirt, stripped of their dignity by their own leaders and waiting for a death that, for some reason, had not yet arrived. The blinding light of the American lines revealed not a killing floor, but a staging area of immense, quiet power, where the expected nightmare was beginning to dissolve into a confusing, sun-drenched silence. The visual reality of the American camp was a sensory assault that defied every tenet of the Japanese civilians' understanding of war. As the women were herded into a makeshift holding area, they did not find the scorched earth wasteland or the chaotic dens of barbarians described in their pamphlets. Instead, they were confronted with the terrifying order of American logistics. They saw mountains of wooden crates, stacks of rubber tires, and rows of pristine, olive-drab tents that seemed to have sprouted from the coral overnight. This was the expected nightmare in a form they could not comprehend, not the presence of death, but the overwhelming presence of things. To a people who had been told that spirit would triumph over steel, the sight of a single American motor pool, bursting with more functional machinery than the entire Japanese garrison, was a psychological blow as heavy as any aerial bombardment. The Japanese soldiers they had known were gaunt, their uniforms threadbare, their movements stiff with the formality of a cult of scarcity. In contrast, the Americans moved with a casual, fluid confidence. They saw men stripped to the waist, their bodies tanned and well-fed, tossing heavy crates of ammunition as if they were playthings. There was no visible fear on the faces of these beasts, only an efficient, bored energy. The women watched as a soldier sat on the bumper of a jeep, casually peeling an orange, the bright, citrus scent cutting through the smell of smoke. The sight of fresh fruit, of excess, of a man eating calmly in the middle of a battlefield was a profound obscenity to those who had been drinking their own sweat to survive. It signaled a level of security and wealth that made the Japanese struggle for victory look like a desperate, doomed fantasy. As they stood in the clearing, the women braced for the inevitable transition to violence. They observed the American weapons, not the bolt-action rifles of their husbands, but an array of semi-automatic Garens, heavy-barreled Brownings, and the terrifying, snub-nosed shapes of Thompson submachine guns. They saw the mechanical abundance of the democratic war machine, the way a single radio operator could summon fire from the sea, or how a medic could produce a roll of clean, white gauze from a waterproof pack. Everything about the American presence suggested a society that valued the preservation of its own life above all else, a philosophy that stood in direct opposition to the Imperial Japanese Code of Bushido. The emotional weight of this realization was paralyzing. They had been prepared for a fight to the death against a savage foe. They were not prepared to be the wretched, starving audience to a display of industrial supremacy. They looked at their own filth-crusted hands and then at the clean, sturdy boots of the guards, feeling the vast distance between their reality and the one they were now entering. The expected nightmare of rape and slaughter was being replaced by a more insidious fear, the fear that their entire sacrifice had been based on a lie. They were not facing demons. They were facing a civilization so vastly equipped that it could afford to be indifferent to their existence. The terror remained, but it began to shift from the fear of what the Americans would do to them to the soul-crushing realization of what the Americans actually were. In the center of this industrial whirlwind, a single object began to bridge the gap between two alien worlds. It was not a weapon, nor a flag, but a standard-issue Model 1910 aluminum canteen, its surface scarred by the grit of the Pacific beaches. To the Marines, this vessel was a mundane piece of gear, a pound of metal and a quart of liquid carried on the hip. To the Japanese women, it was a terrifying mystery. As a young Marine stepped forward, his hand resting on the canvas-covered flask, the women instinctively recoiled, their breaths hitching in dry, constricted throats. They expected a grenade. They expected a weapon of chemical fire. Instead, they watched as the soldier's thumb flicked the cap open, the metal chain jingling with a sound like a small, silver bell against the limestone. The canteen represented more than just water. It was the ultimate symbol of the American logistical miracle. While the Japanese garrison had been reduced to licking the dew off poisonous leaves or digging into the salt-choked earth for a muddy sip of life, the American military had brought the very rivers of their homeland with them. This aluminum vessel was the product of a supply chain that started in the bauxite mines of Arkansas, moved through the smelting plants of the Pacific Northwest, and was filled by water purification units that turned the brackish swamps of the tropics into something clear and sterile. It was a vessel of democracy, a cold, hard fact of material superiority that no amount of spiritual fervor could replicate. The women watched the Marines' every movement with the intensity of the doomed. They noticed the way the condensation formed on the outside of the metal, a shimmering, frosted coat that spoke of a coldness they hadn't felt in months. In the stifling heat of Saipan, where the sun turned the air into a furnace, the sight of a chilled object was almost hallucinatory. The symbol was recurring, present on every belt and attached to every pack, a silver-gray army of vessels that signaled a force that did not need to thirst. For the Japanese, scarcity was a tool of discipline, a way to sharpen the soul for the final sacrifice. For the Americans, abundance was the foundation of the mission. As the Marine tilted the canteen, a few stray droplets spilled onto the parched coral, vanishing instantly into the dust. The women gasped, a collective, involuntary sound of agony at the sight of such waste. To spill water in the Imperial Army was a crime. To spill it here, in front of the dying, seemed like the ultimate act of casual cruelty. They did not yet understand that to the American, water was not a precious, rationed holy relic, but a basic right of the living. The canteen was held out, the sunlight catching the rim of the spout, offering a glimmer of something pure in a world of filth. The symbol of the enemy's power was being extended as a bridge, challenging the women to choose between the thirst of their indoctrination and the life-giving reality of the American metal. The moment of contact arrived not with a blow, but with a gesture of profound, quiet disruption. The Marine stepped into the center of the huddled group, his shadow falling over a young woman who had been shielding her child with a tattered kimono. She looked up, her face a mask of reflexive terror, her muscles tensed for the impact of a boot or a blade. Instead, the soldier knelt, the heavy fabric of his trousers rustling against the grit. He extended his arm, the aluminum canteen gripped in a hand that was calloused and stained with the grease of 1,000 rifle cleanings. He did not bark a command. He simply held the vessel steady, the mouth of the flask positioned toward her. The first sip was preceded by a moment of paralyzed hesitation. The woman stared at the water, her mind racing through the warnings she had lived by. The Americans would poison the wells, they would bait the traps with tainted food, they would lead the innocent to a slow, agonizing death. But the thirst was a physical entity, a jagged claw in her chest that overrode the years of spiritual conditioning. Her hand, trembling so violently that the Marine had to steady her wrist, reached out. As her lips touched the cool, metallic rim, the shock of the temperature sent a jolt through her entire nervous system. The water was not the warm, stagnant soup of the caves. It was clean, flavorless, and impossibly cold. As she drank, the sound of her swallowing was the only noise in the immediate circle. The other women watched with an intensity that bordered on the religious. They were witnessing the systematic dismantling of a theology. If this man were a demon, why did he give of his own life force? If the Americans were monsters who sought only to destroy, why was he wasting a precious resource on a shattered jewel that was supposed to be discarded? The act of drinking became a ritual of realization. With every gulp, the terrifying edifice of the imperial myth crumbled. The water was a physical truth that no pamphlet or radio broadcast could refute. It was the taste of a reality where the enemy was human and the protectors were the ones who had demanded her death. When she finished, the Marine did not snatch the canteen back. He moved to the next woman, and then the next, repeating the motion with a practiced, mechanical kindness. This was the shock of the water, the realization that the American abundance was not just a tool of war, but a tool of mercy. For the Japanese women, this was a psychological earthquake. They had been prepared to die for a god who required their suffering. They were now being saved by an enemy who offered them a drink. The simple act of providing water before asking a single question, before even demanding their names, inverted their entire understanding of power and morality. The thirst was gone, replaced by a devastating, liberating confusion that began to wash away the stains of a decade of lies. The delivery of a single cup of water was not merely a random act of kindness by an individual Marine. It was the final, localized expression of the most sophisticated logistical apparatus in the history of human conflict. To the Japanese women, the water seemed like a miracle, but to the American military, it was a calculated requirement of the democratic war machine. While the Japanese Empire operated on a philosophy of spiritual attrition, believing that the Yamato spirit could overcome the lack of physical supplies, the United States had industrialized the very concept of mercy. Behind every canteen held by a dusty corporal stood a line of water purification units, filtration systems, and quartermaster corps that saw the health of a prisoner as a metric of success. This was the logistics of democracy. Factual records of the Pacific Theater reveal that for every frontline combatant, the United States maintained several tons of supplies and a dedicated support staff to manage them. On Saipan, while the Japanese command was ordering its men to forage for roots and drink from stagnant puddles, the Americans were landing specialized equipment designed to turn the salty, bacteria-laden tropical water into something safe for human consumption. This capability was a strategic weapon. By maintaining the health of the captured, the Americans were able to gather intelligence, maintain order, and, most importantly, demonstrate the utter futility of the Japanese struggle. The ability to provide was the ultimate proof of the ability to win. The women observed this efficiency with a growing, hollow sense of awe. They saw the water buffalo trailers, large, olive-drab tanks on wheels, being towed by trucks that never seemed to run out of fuel. They saw Marines using soap and water to wash the grime from their faces, a display of luxury that was unthinkable in the starving Japanese lines. This was the material reality of a nation that viewed its soldiers not as disposable shards of a jewel, but as valuable citizens who required the best the state could provide. In the American camp, water was a utility. In the Japanese camp, it had become a fading memory. The sheer volume of the American supply chain acted as a silent psychological artillery, shattering the resolve of the captives more effectively than any bombardment. The historical truth of the encounter lay in this disparity. The American forces did not just bring guns to Saipan. They brought an entire civilization, complete with its surplus and its bureaucratic insistence on procedure. There were forms to be filled out, medical screenings to be conducted, and rations to be distributed, all of which required a stable supply of clean water. For the Japanese women, being processed through this system was their first encounter with a government that functioned on the principle of sustainment rather than sacrifice. The logistics were the ideology made manifest. Every crate of K rations and every jerrycan of water was a testament to a world that had moved beyond the medieval requirements of the imperial cult. They were being absorbed into a system that was too large to hate them and too wealthy to let them die. The physical satiation of their thirst brought with it a far more painful psychological rupture, the total shattering of faith. As the water cleared the dust from their throats, it also seemed to wash away the opaque film of indoctrination that had colored their vision for decades. The women sat in the dirt, their bodies finally hydrated, but their minds spiraling into a vacuum. For years, they had been told that the Americans were oni, ogres who would skin them alive. They had been told that their only salvation lay in the divine protection of the emperor and the honor of a self-inflicted death. Yet, in the presence of the enemy, they found a quiet, professional humanity that was nowhere to be found among their own retreating commanders. This realization was not a sudden burst of joy, it was a devastating, soul-crushing weight. To accept the water was to acknowledge that their government had lied to them. To survive was to realize that the thousands who had already leaped from the cliffs of Marpy Point had died for a fabrication. The women looked at one another, eyes brimming with a new kind of grief, the grief of the deceived. They had watched their sisters throw their infants into the sea to save them from the monsters, only to find that the monsters were young men who offered chocolate and clean bandages. The spiritual foundation of their world, built on the necessity of sacrifice and the inherent evil of the outsider, collapsed into the sun-baked coral of the American encampment. The emotional transformation was visible in their posture. The rigid, terrified tension that had defined their existence in the caves began to give way to a hollow, slumped exhaustion. They were no longer martyrs in waiting. They were survivors of a failed ideology. They watched as the Marines moved with an easy, unburdened grace, realizing that these men were not fueled by a desperate, fanatical hate, but by a confident, almost casual sense of purpose. The Japanese women had been taught that life was a burden to be discarded for the state, but here, in the shadow of the American water tanks, they saw a world where life was something to be maintained, fed, and protected with a vast, industrial fervor. This shattering of faith extended beyond the personal to the national. If the Americans were not the beasts they were promised, then the war itself was not the holy crusade they had been told it was. The silence that fell over the group was the silence of a people whose internal compass had been demagnetized. They were adrift in a sea of American abundance, realizing that the victory their leaders promised was a phantom and the defeat they feared was, in fact, the only thing that could save them. The water had not just saved their lives, it had destroyed their world, leaving them with the agonizing task of rebuilding their identities from the wreckage of a shattered jewel that was never actually a gem, but a chain. The sensory expansion of the American presence soon moved beyond the canteen, evolving into a total immersion in the material culture of the West. Once the women had been hydrated, the Marines began to open the small, tan-colored boxes of K rations, pulling out items that looked like artifacts from another dimension. To a Japanese civilian who had spent the last month chewing on charred sugarcane or nothing at all, the sight of the contents was a psychological assault. There were small tins of processed meat, biscuits that did not crumble into dust, and even sticks of gum and cigarettes. The recurring symbol of abundance shifted from the water to the ration, a concentrated block of caloric wealth that proved the Americans did not just have enough to survive, but enough to share. This was the final stage of their physical and ideological transition. The women watched as the American medics moved among them, their sleeves rolled up, applying antiseptic and clean white gauze to wounds that had been festering for weeks. The touch of the medics was professional and devoid of the expected malice. In the Imperial Japanese Army, Medical resources were so scarce that they were often reserved only for those who could return to the fight. The civilian was an afterthought in the economy of survival. Here, the Americans used their vast surplus of morphine and sulfa powder on the enemy with a routine efficiency. The women felt the cooling sting of the medicine and the pressure of the bandages, realizing that these monsters possessed a science and a supply chain that valued the integrity of the human body. The transformation was reinforced by the sounds and smells of the American rear echelon. They heard the distant, rhythmic thumping of a generator and saw the glow of electric lights as evening approached, a display of power that conquered even the darkness. The scent of the camp was one of greasy engines, soapy water, and the sweet, artificial smell of American candy. Every sense was being bombarded by the reality of a superpower. The Japanese women sat on the ground, wrapped in oversized olive-drab blankets provided by the quartermaster, feeling the weight of the wool against their skin. It was a heavy, scratchy warmth that stood in stark contrast to the damp, cold rags they had worn in the caves. As they ate the unfamiliar food, the internal collapse of the imperial cult was completed by the external evidence of American benevolence. They were experiencing a total peace that was as overwhelming as the total war they had been promised. The abundance was not just in the objects, but in the time and care offered to them. The Marines did not treat them as trophies or as burdens, but as a logistical task to be completed with a certain level of rugged, American decency. This encounter with the American surplus, the food, the medicine, the light, and the warmth, acted as the final solvent, dissolving the last remnants of the propaganda that had held them captive. They were no longer cogs in a war machine. They were individuals being sustained by a civilization that could afford to be kind. The sun finally dipped below the horizon of the Philippine Sea, casting long, bruised shadows across the jagged limestone of Saipan. For the women gathered in the flickering light of the American camp, the world had fundamentally changed in the span of a single afternoon. They sat in a silence that was no longer born of terror, but of a profound, poetic exhaustion. Behind them lay the cliffs of Marpy Point, a monument to a dark, sacrificial faith that had demanded their annihilation. Before them lay a sea of olive-drab tents and the quiet, rhythmic hum of a giant that had no need for their deaths. The aluminum canteen, now empty and hooked back onto a Marine's belt, remained the silent protagonist of their salvation. It was a humble vessel that had carried more than just water. It had carried the undeniable truth of a different way of life. The experience of these women stands as a historical testament to a singular, powerful reality, that the most effective weapon in the arsenal of freedom is not the bullet, but the bread and the water of a confident, abundant society. Their shock was not merely a reaction to a drink, but a reaction to the sudden, overwhelming realization that their lives had intrinsic value, a value recognized by their enemies even when it was denied by their own leaders. In the grand tapestry of the Second World War, this small encounter on a Pacific hillside serves as an enduring symbol of the triumph of ideology through material and moral grace. It reveals that the ultimate defeat of a totalitarian regime does not occur on the battlefield alone, but in the heart of the individual, when the lie of scarcity is finally met with the truth of abundance. The Japanese women who survived Saipan did so because they chose the cold metal of an American canteen over the cold stone of a martyr's grave. They became living witnesses to the fact that a civilization's greatest strength lies not in how many it can kill, but in how many it can sustain. The legacy of Saipan is often written in the blood of the shattered jewels, but the deeper truth is found in the survivors who walked out of the darkness and into the light of a democratic mercy. It is a reflection on the nature of freedom itself, a force that does not demand the sacrifice of the innocent, but provides the resources to protect them. As the tropical night finally settled over the island, the memory of the first sip remained, a cool, clear reminder that in the face of absolute tyranny, the simplest act of human kindness is the most revolutionary act of all. The water had washed away an empire, leaving behind the quiet, enduring hope of a world where abundance is used to preserve life rather than to fuel its destruction.